April 1943, the Pacific war front was boiling with heat, both from the climate and the relentless battle between nations. The air was thick with the smell of salt from the nearby ocean, mingled with gunpowder and sweat from the soldiers who had been marching for hours under a punishing sun. Private Harris, a young man from Kansas who had never seen a jungle before the war, found himself swallowed by towering trees, vines that coiled like snakes, and a green darkness that seemed alive with whispers. His uniform clung to him, drenched in sweat, and his boots sank into the wet ground with every step. He carried with him a rifle strapped across his back, heavy with dwindling ammunition, and in his holster rested a weapon many around him had mocked. The Colt .45 pistol. The whispers about American sidearms had spread even before Harris was shipped overseas. Soldiers often compared weapons, bragging about rifles, grenades, and machine guns, while scoffing at the small pistols. Enemies, too, carried rifles with long barrels that could cut a man down from a distance, and the Japanese soldiers boasted of their bayonets, sharp and gleaming. To them, the Colt seemed laughable. A sidearm too small, too weak, a weapon for last chances, not real fighting. But Harris had grown up with stories of American steel, of weapons crafted not just for appearance, but for survival. He had never forgotten his father's words before leaving home. A weapon's strength isn't in its size, son, but in the way it speaks when the moment comes. And as Harris trudged through that suffocating jungle, those words burned in his memory. The unit had been marching for hours, trying to link up with another group farther inland. Their path had been carefully chosen, winding through dense undergrowth where the sunlight only dripped in golden fragments, painting the soldiers' helmets and rifles with fleeting streaks of light. Every rustle of leaves set their nerves on edge. They were far from home, in a place where the enemy seemed to emerge from shadows, where every tree might hide danger. The tension weighed heavy. Harris adjusted the strap of his pack, his eyes flicking to the pistol at his side. It wasn't just steel, it was reassurance, a companion that hadn't failed him yet. Suddenly, the silence shattered. The crack of enemy fire burst through the air, bullets slicing into the trees and ground around them. Shouts erupted as Harris and his fellow soldiers dove for cover, pressing against the earth, their hearts pounding. The jungle exploded with sound, rifles snapping, branches breaking, and voices shouting in a language they couldn't understand but knew too well. Harris pressed his face into the damp ground, breathing fast, gripping his rifle tightly. His unit had been ambushed, surrounded in a place where escape was nearly impossible. The officer barked commands, trying to form a line, but the chaos was overwhelming. Men scrambled behind logs, returned fire blindly into the thick green, and prayed they could hold their ground. Harris fired his rifle, the recoil kicking against his shoulder, the muzzle flash lighting up the shadows. He saw figures darting between trees, their helmets low, their bayonets catching the light like fangs. His rifle's magazine emptied faster than he expected, and he reached for another clip, but his hand trembled when he realized they were running low. The jungle felt like it was closing in, suffocating. Pressing down on their small unit like a predator ready to strike, sweat stung his eyes as he reloaded. But the fear wasn't just in his hands, it was in the entire group. Harris glanced at his comrades. Some were already hit, clutching their sides, blood mixing with mud. The officer's voice was drowned out by the relentless crack of enemy fire. Panic threatened to sweep through them, the kind of panic that could crush even the strongest soldier when outnumbered and outgunned. And in that instant, Harris's gaze fell to the holster at his side. The Colt .45 rested there, silent, patient, as though waiting for the moment to prove itself. He thought back to the mocking voices, soldiers who said the pistol was too heavy, too slow, a waste of space compared to rifles. Even enemies had spread propaganda about the weakness of American pistols, comparing them to their long-barreled rifles. Yet Harris remembered the weapon's weight the first time he held it, the way the grip settled into his palm, the balance of it, the authority it carried even when silent. He had fired it on the training grounds back home, and the sound had thundered in his ears. a sound so powerful it felt like it could shake the ground. To Harris, the Colt wasn't weak. It was waiting like a sleeping lion underestimated until it opened its mouth. The enemy fire grew closer, bullets snapping against the wood of the log that sheltered him. Harris ducked, his rifle nearly empty again. The officer signaled to hold, but Harris could see the fear in his comrades' eyes. They were running out of options, trapped in a deadly game with no easy way out. Harris reached down, his fingers brushing the cool steel of the Colt's handle. For a moment the world seemed to slow. The sound of gunfire dimmed in his ears, and all he could hear was his heartbeat, steady and strong. He pulled the pistol free, the weight of it solid and familiar, as though it had been waiting for this very moment. The jungle around him was chaos, but inside Harris there was clarity. The Colt 45 wasn't just a weapon. It was a voice, and soon that voice would roar. The gunfire did not stop. It came in waves, echoing through the thick Pacific jungle as if the trees themselves were spitting bullets. Harris pressed his back against the damp log, heart pounding like a drum in his chest. His ears rang with the sharp cracks of rifles, the whiz of bullets cutting through leaves, and the cries of his comrades scattered around him. The officer barked orders, but the sound was almost drowned in the chaos. Men were low on ammunition, some already clutching their wounds, their uniforms stained with blood and mud. The ground shook as grenades exploded in the distance, and the smell of gunpowder mixed with the heavy, wet air. The Americans had fought bravely, pushing forward for hours, but this ambush had left them exposed, cornered and with little to fight back. The Japanese soldiers pressed closer, their discipline evident in the way they advanced. Shouts in their native tongue carried through the jungle as they moved in a tightening ring. Harris could see their silhouettes through the gaps in the leaves, rifles raised, bayonets gleaming like knives meant to tear through flesh. Every step they took was full of confidence, the kind that comes when an enemy knows he has the advantage. Harris fumbled with his rifle, shoving in another clip, but he knew it wouldn't last. The box of spare ammunition his squad had carried was already gone. Men around him were yelling for more rounds, some with rifles empty, reduced to clutching their bayonets as they crouched in desperation. Harris felt the knot of fear in his stomach tighten. A man without bullets in the middle of an enemy swarm was as good as dead. The officer tried to rally the men, shouting for them to hold the line, to keep firing. But the words carried less weight as rifles fell silent one by one, the clack of empty chambers replacing the snap of bullets. Harris glanced around, counting. They were fewer than 15 now, and the enemy advancing toward them seemed like a tide. Dozens, maybe more, closing in with unshakable determination. Harris saw one of his friends, Corporal Lewis, lying face down near a tree, his hand still clutching a rifle he'd never fire again. The sight hit Harris like a punch to the chest. The noise grew deafening as the Japanese soldiers fired volley after volley, bullets tearing chunks from the trees. The Americans hugged the ground, trapped, pinned with nowhere to run. Harris tasted mud on his lips as he pressed his face into the earth. His rifle barked a few final times before it clicked empty. He fumbled for another clip, but his pouch was bare. A hollow dread filled him. His rifle was useless now. He pulled it close anyway, gripping it like a shield, though it was no more than dead weight. It was then, through the ringing chaos, that his hand brushed against the pistol at his side. The Colt 45. For a second he hesitated, almost ashamed. How could a sidearm, mocked as weak and outdated, stand against the oncoming wave of rifles and bayonets? He remembered the sneers of other soldiers back in camp, laughing about pocket guns that were only good for officers or last-minute suicide shots. But his father's voice echoed again in his head. When the time comes, the real weapon will speak for itself. Harris's fingers curled around the grip, pulling the pistol free. The weight of it was reassuring, heavy yet balanced, not at all like the fragile thing others claimed it to be. He checked the magazine quickly, 7 rounds. 7 chances, 7 answers to the enemy's arrogance. He swallowed hard, sweat pouring down his forehead. and raised the weapon as the first line of enemy soldiers broke through the trees. Yelling, bayonets lowered, the officer shouted something, but Harris barely heard it. His world narrowed to the space in front of him, to the dark barrel of the Colt aimed squarely at the advancing figures. His finger tightened, and the pistol spoke. The shot was like thunder in the jungle, a sound so different from the sharp crack of rifles. It was deeper, heavier, a roar instead of a snap. The first enemy soldier staggered, his rifle falling as he collapsed into the mud. Harris adjusted, fired again, the Colt bucking in his hand but steady under his grip. Another soldier went down. The enemy's advance faltered, surprise flashing across their faces. They had expected easy prey, men broken and empty-handed. Instead, the Colt 45 answered them with raw, brutal force. Harris fired again, the recoil slamming into his palm, but he didn't flinch. Each shot felt like it carried not just lead, but defiance, the voice of a soldier who refused to die quietly. The pistol barked over and over, and with every report an enemy fell. The jungle echoed with its deep roar, so powerful that even the Americans nearby lifted their heads in disbelief. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The jungle fell quiet except for the Colt's voice and the cries of the men it struck. Harris moved from cover, crouched low, and fired again, each bullet deliberate, each strike forcing the enemy back a step. They had rifles, yes, and they had numbers, but the Colt's bullets hit harder, faster, cutting through the air with finality. Harris's comrades, inspired by the sight, picked up their own rifles, using what little ammunition they had left to cover him. Together they fought like men reborn, their courage reignited by the power of one sidearm. Harris's breaths came fast, his chest rising and falling as he kept firing. The pistol was hot now, the smell of burnt powder clinging to it, smoke curling upward in the humid air. He gritted his teeth and focused, the world blurring around him until there was nothing but the front sight of the pistol and the enemy beyond it. Each shot struck with deadly accuracy, as though the Colt itself guided his hand. The enemy hesitated, the momentum of their charge broken. Their shouts grew less confident, their steps less sure. They had expected weakness, but what they saw was strength, raw and undeniable. Harris's pistol spoke louder than their rifles, louder than their bayonets, louder than their numbers. It was the sound of defiance, of American steel refusing to yield. The Colt thundered again, its roar echoing through the jungle like the voice of some iron beast awakened from slumber. Harris's arm jerked back with each recoil, but his stance remained firm, his determination anchoring him to the ground. The first soldier he hit dropped instantly, the shockwave of the heavy round ripping through his chest. The others hesitated, caught in the split-second disbelief that a sidearm could hold such punishing force. They had been told that American pistols were weak, more toys than tools, meant only for close quarters when desperation was already certain. Yet here, in the heat of battle, the Colt's voice spoke a different truth, one that carried fear straight into their hearts. Harris didn't allow himself to think about odds, or numbers, or even the time that was slipping away. His world had shrunk to the rhythm of the fight: aim, squeeze, recoil, reload, repeat. Every shot cracked the air, and every muzzle flash lit up his face in short, harsh bursts, like snapshots of defiance carved into the jungle darkness. The Japanese soldiers, once confident, faltered with each step closer. Their bayonets no longer gleamed like symbols of victory, but flashed like desperate blades, forced forward by men whose courage wavered. The pistol's rounds tore into the line with terrifying efficiency. Harris felt the raw energy of each shot ripple through his arm, and though his ears rang from the deafening report, the sound became a battle cry in itself. His comrades, scattered and shaken, looked up from their shallow cover and saw what was happening. They had thought it was over, thought they were already ghosts in that green hell. But now they saw one man standing with nothing but a sidearm, holding back a force that should have crushed them. Courage, like fire catching in dry brush, spread through the men. "Keep firing!" someone shouted, their voice cracked with fear, but tinged with newfound strength. A few soldiers scrambled to their feet, rifles raised, squeezing off the last of their precious ammunition to cover Harris. Their bullets snapped overhead, joining the booming rhythm of the Colt. The Japanese line wavered. A few fell back, shouting to one another, their confidence bleeding away with every man Harris cut down. They had not expected resistance like this, not from a man clutching a pistol. Their doctrine told them numbers would always crush a smaller force. But doctrine had not accounted for the weight of the Colt's rounds, the precision of its strike, or the iron will behind the trigger. Harris reloaded, his hands working fast, sweat dripping into his eyes, the heat of the barrel radiating through his glove. His breaths came in ragged gasps, but his focus was absolute. He thought of home, of the wheat fields back in Kansas, where the wind whispered across golden stalks, and where his father had taught him to shoot cans off fence posts with an old revolver. That training had felt like a game then, but now it was life or death. Every lesson mattered. Every memory steadied his aim. The pistol cracked again and again. Each shot ripped through the dense jungle air with authority. The enemy no longer moved forward in unison. Their steps staggered, their formation broken. They glanced at each other, unsure. Fear crept into their ranks, gnawing at their discipline. The myth of the weak American pistol shattered before their eyes, replaced with the harsh truth of its devastating power. Harris pushed forward a step, his boots sinking into the mud, and fired once more. The sheer defiance in his movement unnerved the enemy further. He wasn't retreating, wasn't cowering, he was advancing, forcing them back with the roar of a single pistol. To the Japanese soldiers, it was as though the Colt itself had become a machine gun in his hands. Its voice multiplied by courage and desperation. His comrades yelled in support, some firing blindly to add weight to the fight, others simply shouting to drown out the fear. The jungle pulsed with noise, gunfire, shouts, the screams of the wounded. But through it all, the Colt's thunder stood out, undeniable and unforgettable. The pistol clicked empty. Harris dropped behind cover, his hands moving fast as he shoved another magazine into the grip. His chest heaved, his arms burned, but his eyes never wavered. As he snapped the slide forward and rose again, he saw the enemy hesitate. Their eyes betrayed them. They no longer saw just a soldier. They saw a wall, a force, a man armed with something that shouldn't have been possible but was. The Colt spat fire once more, and the enemy broke. Some ducked for cover behind trees. Others fell back, shouting commands Harris couldn't understand, but recognized as fear. What had begun as an overwhelming charge had turned into a stuttering retreat. They weren't beaten yet, not fully, but the tide had shifted. The Americans were no longer prey. Harris felt his arm grow heavy with the constant firing, but adrenaline pushed him past exhaustion. He could feel every muscle in his body straining, yet the pistol remained steady, as though the weapon itself shared his resolve. His comrades watched him with wide eyes, disbelief mixing with awe. The Colt 45 was no longer just a sidearm. It had become their salvation. One by one, enemy soldiers fell under its thunder, and those who remained began to question their orders. What good were numbers when each step forward brought another body to the ground? The Colt had become a force multiplier, one man's courage magnified into something that felt larger than life. The enemy had mocked American pistols, but now, under the roar of its voice, they could no longer deny its truth. The jungle smelled of smoke and blood, the ground littered with shell casings, broken branches, and fallen men. Harris's arm ached, his body screamed for rest, but he couldn't stop. Not yet. The pistol spoke again and again, answering the enemy's arrogance with fire and steel. By now, even the officer, pinned under fire, stared at Harris with a look that blended shock and admiration. He had doubted the pistol, too, once. Everyone had. But now, watching Harris carve a wall of resistance with nothing but the Colt, he realized they had underestimated not just the weapon, but the spirit behind it. Every thunderous report told a story. That American steel, no matter how small, could never be underestimated. Each shot was a statement of survival, of defiance, of strength. And though the enemy outnumbered them, though the jungle seemed to crush in from all sides, Harris stood unbroken, his Colt answering every threat with the voice of iron. When the final magazine ran low, when the smoke curled heavy in the air and the jungle had grown eerily quiet for a moment. Harris knew he had done something more than just fight. He had turned a weapon once dismissed as weak into the very symbol of American grit. The Colt had spoken, and the world around him had no choice but to listen. The minutes stretched into what felt like entire lifetimes. Every second was carved out of fire, smoke, and sweat. Harris's breaths came ragged, his lungs burning as if the jungle itself was suffocating him. His arm trembled, muscles aching from the relentless recoil of the Colt 45, but his grip did not loosen. The pistol was more than a weapon now. It was an extension of his will. The enemy had come in waves, their rifles spitting fire, their bayonets flashing like teeth of predators. Yet one by one, those waves had broken against the thunder of the Colt. The battlefield fell into an uneasy silence, pierced only by groans of the wounded and the occasional echo of a distant shot. Smoke hung thick, curling upward through the green canopy, as if the jungle itself was exhaling after the storm. Harris lowered the pistol for a moment, its barrel glowing faintly, the smell of burnt powder clinging to it. His hand was slick with sweat, but he held it like a priest would a sacred relic. Around him, his fellow soldiers began to stir, disbelief written across their dirt-streaked faces. They had been seconds from collapse, seconds from being swallowed whole by the enemy. But the Colt had spoken, and they were still alive. Harris looked at their faces, boys who had been hardened into men in a crucible of fire. They stared back at him not just with gratitude, but with something else, awe. They had mocked the sidearm, joked about its weight, claimed it was a relic of an older war. Now their survival was etched into its every shot. Some gave small nods, as if words would fail to capture what they had witnessed. For them, the Colt was no longer just a pistol. It was a savior. The jungle rustled again. Harris froze, raising the pistol, finger brushing the trigger. His ears strained, and soon he heard it, more footsteps moving cautiously this time. The enemy was not gone. They were regrouping, testing the silence. Harris's heart pounded. His last magazine was nearly empty. He counted the bullets left, 3. 3 rounds to face, however many remained. His mouth went dry, but his resolve hardened. If this was the end, he would not let it be a quiet one. The first enemy soldier appeared through the trees, moving slower now, his rifle raised cautiously. Behind him, more shadows flickered in the dense brush. Their charge had been broken, but their pride still pushed them forward. Harris steadied the Colt, exhaling slowly. The pistol roared again. The first man fell instantly, his body twisting as he collapsed into the undergrowth. The others shouted, ducking back behind trees. Harris fired again, forcing them deeper into cover. The sound tore through the jungle, echoing like a drumbeat of defiance. Then came the final shot. The last bullet in the magazine. Harris lined it carefully, sweat dripping into his eyes, and pulled the trigger. The Colt spat its last round, the sound booming like thunder across the battlefield. Another soldier dropped, and then the pistol fell silent, its voice spent. Harris lowered it slowly, his chest heaving. He had no more ammunition, no more thunder left. But in that silence, something extraordinary happened. The enemy didn't surge forward. They didn't charge. Instead, they hesitated, whispering among themselves, their courage shattered. To them, it seemed impossible that one man with a pistol had held them back, that one small weapon had carved such devastation. Fear gnawed at their discipline, and slowly they began to retreat. One by one they melted back into the trees, their rifles lowered, their voices fading into the depths of the jungle. The Americans, bloodied and exhausted, lifted their heads in disbelief. They had survived the unthinkable, not because of their rifles or their numbers, but because of one pistol and the man who had refused to let it be underestimated. Harris collapsed against the log, the Colt resting across his lap. His hands trembled, but his eyes were clear. Around him the soldiers began to regroup, helping the wounded, gathering what little ammunition they could salvage from fallen comrades. The officer approached, his face streaked with mud and sweat, his eyes wide. For a moment he said nothing, just looked at the pistol and then at Harris. Finally he gave a slow nod. "You saved us," he said quietly. "That gun saved us." Harris looked down at the Colt, its steel darkened with smoke, its barrel warm. He thought of his father's words, thought of all the times people had called it weak, outdated, unworthy of respect. He smiled faintly, shaking his head. "It wasn't just the gun," he whispered, though no one around him heard. "It was never just the gun." The jungle remained quiet, as if even nature respected what had transpired. The sun dipped lower, streaking the sky above the canopy with shades of orange and red. The surviving Americans slowly gathered themselves, ready to move again, ready to keep fighting another day. But they would never forget this moment. In the thick green of the Pacific, where the enemy had believed victory certain, the Colt 45 had spoken loud enough for history to remember. And long after the battle ended, long after Harris and his comrades left that jungle behind, stories would spread. Tales whispered in camps, carried across oceans, told in quiet voices by men who had seen death and survived. Tales of how the enemy mocked American pistols, until one day, in the heart of the Pacific, the Colt 45 proved them wrong.